When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, more than 6 million Japanese soldiers found themselves facing an uncertain future. Some were scattered across the vast Pacific, from the jungles of Burma to remote islands thousands of miles from home. Others stood on Japanese soil, witnessing American forces occupy their homeland for the first time in history. The Emperor's voice crackled over the radio, announcing the unthinkable, in his high, formal tone that the war was lost. For soldiers who had been taught that death was preferable to surrender, who had sworn to fight until the last man, this moment represented not just military defeat, but a complete shattering of their world. Some would face war crimes, trials and execution. Others would spend years in brutal captivity. A few would refuse to believe the war had ended, continuing to fight for decades in the jungle. Many would return home to a devastated nation, struggling to find their place in a society transformed by occupation and defeat. In this video, we will find out what really happened to these millions of men after the Emperor's voice fell silent. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Hideki Tojo stands as perhaps the most recognizable face of Japan's military leadership during World War II. Born in Tokyo in 1884 into a military family, Tojo followed his father's footsteps into the Imperial Japanese Army. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1905 and quickly distinguished himself as a talented officer with an almost fanatical devotion to military discipline and emperor worship. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Tojo rose steadily through the ranks, serving in various staff positions and developing a reputation as a hardliner who believed in Japan's destiny to dominate Asia. He became Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria in 1937, where he oversaw brutal military operations against Chinese forces and civilians. His aggressive stance and organizational skills caught the attention of Emperor Hirohito and the military establishment. In 1940, Tojo was appointed Minister of War, and just 1 year later, in October 1941, he became Prime Minister of Japan, while simultaneously holding the positions of War Minister and later Home Minister and Foreign Minister, consolidating unprecedented power in his hands. As Prime Minister, Tojo was the driving force behind the decision to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, launching Japan into total war against the United States and the Allied powers. He micromanaged military operations throughout the war, often interfering with strategic decisions and dismissing generals who disagreed with his vision. His leadership style was autocratic and uncompromising, earning him both respect for his dedication and criticism for his inflexibility. As Japan's military situation deteriorated following defeats at Midway in 1942 and the steady American advance across the Pacific, Tojo's position became increasingly untenable. The loss of Saipan in July 1944 proved to be the final straw. The fall of this strategic island brought American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, and Tojo was forced to resign on July 18, 1944, though he retained his military rank. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Tojo knew what awaited him. On September 11, 1945, as American military police arrived at his home to arrest him, he attempted suicide by shooting himself in the chest with a pistol. He had marked the location of his heart with charcoal to ensure accuracy, but the bullet missed the vital organ. American medics, ironically, saved his life with blood transfusions, ensuring he would face trial. Tojo was nursed back to health specifically to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, commonly known as the Tokyo Trials, which began on May 3, 1946. The tribunal was held in the former Japanese Army headquarters in Ichigaya, Tokyo, and was modelled after the Nuremberg trials in Germany. Tojo faced multiple charges, including waging wars of aggression, ordering and permitting atrocities against prisoners of war and civilian populations, and various other war crimes and crimes against humanity. Throughout the trial, which lasted 2.5 years, Tojo maintained a defiant stance, accepting full responsibility for Japan's actions, but insisting that Japan had been forced into war by Western powers who sought to strangle Japan economically. He argued that the war had been necessary for Japan's survival and that he had acted in accordance with the emperor's will, though he was careful to shield Emperor Hirohito from any blame, insisting all decisions had been made by the military leadership. The evidence against Tojo was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented documentation of his involvement in planning aggressive wars, his knowledge of and complicity in atrocities such as the Bataan Death March, the use of forced labor, the mistreatment of prisoners of war, and numerous other crimes. Witnesses testified about orders that had come directly from his office. On November 12, 1948, Tojo was found guilty on all 7 counts against him. He was sentenced to death by hanging. In his final statement before sentencing, Tojo expressed no remorse for the war itself, though he apologized for the suffering of the Japanese people. On December 23, 1948, just after midnight, Hideki Tojo was hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, along with 6 other convicted war criminals. He was 64 years old, his body was cremated, and his ashes scattered in the Pacific Ocean to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for militarists. However, some ashes were secretly preserved by sympathizers and later interred at the controversial Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where his inclusion remains a source of international tension to this day. Moving to our next figure, Tomoyuki Yamashta presents one of the most controversial cases of post-war justice. Known as the Tiger of Malaya for his stunning conquest of Singapore in February 1942, Yamashta was born in 1885 in Shikoku and entered military service in 1905. He built a distinguished career as a military strategist and commander, studying in Europe and developing a deep understanding of modern warfare. His greatest triumph came when he led the 25th Army in the lightning conquest of Malaya and Singapore, forcing the surrender of over 130,000 British, Indian and Australian troops in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The speed and efficiency of his campaign earned him international recognition as one of Japan's finest generals. However, his success also bred resentment among rivals in Tokyo, particularly Hideki Tojo, who viewed Yamashta as a potential political threat. Tojo effectively sidelined Yamashta by assigning him to relatively unimportant commands, keeping him away from the central war effort. It wasn't until late in the war in October 1944 that Yamashta was given command of the 14th Area Army in the Philippines, tasked with defending the islands against the expected American invasion. By this time, the situation was desperate. Japan's navy had been decimated, air superiority was lost, and American forces under General Douglas MacArthur were landing in overwhelming strength. Yamashta recognized the impossibility of his situation and adopted a defensive strategy, withdrawing his main forces to the mountains of northern Luzon to conduct a prolonged resistance. He ordered Manila to be declared an open city to spare it from destruction. However, naval forces under Admiral Iwabuchi, who were not under Yamashta's command, refused to evacuate and instead fought a savage battle in the city. The result was the Manila Massacre, one of the worst atrocities of the Pacific War, in which an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed during a month of urban combat and deliberate massacres. Japanese forces committed unspeakable acts of brutality, including mass executions, rapes, and the wholesale destruction of the city. Yamashta, commanding from the mountains, was unaware of the full extent of these atrocities as communications had broken down. When the war ended in August 1945, Yamashta surrendered his remaining forces and was taken into American custody. What happened next would become one of the most debated legal cases in military history. General MacArthur, who had been forced to flee the Philippines in 1942 and had made a famous promise to return, was determined to see justice served for the Manila atrocities. Yamashta was charged with failing to control his troops and prevent atrocities, a novel legal concept that would later be known as command responsibility. The trial began on October 29, 1945, in Manila, conducted by an American military commission. Yamashta's defense team, led by American military lawyers, argued that he could not be held responsible for crimes committed by troops not under his direct command, and that the breakdown of communications and the chaos of the final months made it impossible for him to know about or prevent the atrocities. They presented evidence that Yamashta had actually ordered Manila to be evacuated and that the naval forces had acted independently. The prosecution, however, argued that as the commanding general in the Philippines, Yamashta bore ultimate responsibility for all Japanese forces in the area and should have taken measures to prevent atrocities even in the midst of military collapse. The trial was conducted with remarkable speed, lasting only 6 weeks. On December 7, 1945, exactly 4 years after Pearl Harbor, Yamashta was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. His lawyers appealed to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the military commission had violated his rights to due process. In a landmark decision, the Supreme Court voted 6-2 to uphold. The verdict, though Justices Murphy and Rutledge wrote powerful dissenting opinions, arguing that Yamashta had been denied a fair trial, and that the legal standard of command responsibility was being applied retroactively and unjustly. On February 23, 1946, Tomoyuki Yamashta was hanged in Manila at the age of 60. His final words were a poem composed in the traditional Japanese style, expressing his acceptance of fate. The concept of command responsibility established in his trial would have lasting implications for international law, being cited in subsequent war crimes prosecutions, including those following the conflicts in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. However, many legal scholars continue to debate whether Yamashta received justice or became a scapegoat for crimes he could not have prevented. The case remains a powerful example of the complexities and moral ambiguities inherent in post-war justice. Masaharu Homma offers another deeply controversial case in the annals of post-war trials. Born in 1887 in Niigata Prefecture, Homma came from a wealthy family and received an elite education before entering the Imperial Japanese Army in 1907. He was considered one of the more cosmopolitan and Western-friendly Japanese generals, having served as a military attaché in London during the 1920s, where he developed an appreciation for British culture and made many English friends. He spoke fluent English and was known among his peers as being less fanatically militaristic than many of his contemporaries. Despite these qualities, Homma would become forever associated with one of the Pacific War's most notorious atrocities. In December 1941, Homma was given command of the 14th Army and tasked with the invasion of the Philippines. His forces landed on Luzon on December 22, 1941, and despite fierce resistance from combined American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur, Japanese troops steadily advanced. MacArthur was forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, where his forces held out for months under increasingly desperate conditions. By April 1942, with no hope of reinforcement or relief, the defenders of Bataan were starving and diseased. On April 9, 1942, approximately 76,000 Filipino and American troops surrendered to Japanese forces, the largest surrender in American military history. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March. The prisoners were forced to march approximately 65 miles from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell under brutal conditions. Japanese guards, many of whom were rear echelon troops unfamiliar with combat and contemptuous of prisoners who had surrendered rather than fight to the death, subjected the captives to beatings, random executions, denial of food and water, and various other cruelties. Men who fell behind were bayoneted or shot. The exact death toll remains disputed, but it is estimated that between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino prisoners and between 500 and 650 American prisoners died during the march or in the immediate aftermath. The Japanese military had made inadequate preparations for handling such a large number of prisoners, and the combination of logistical failure, cultural contempt for surrender, and individual acts of cruelty created a humanitarian catastrophe. Homma himself was not present during the march, being occupied with military operations against the forces still holding out on Corregidor. The question that would haunt his post-war trial was what he knew about the treatment of the prisoners and what steps he took to prevent or punish the atrocities. After the surrender of Corregidor on May 6, 1942, Homma was relieved of his command, ostensibly promoted but actually removed from active duty due to military rivals in Tokyo who resented his success and his relatively moderate views. He spent the remainder of the war in relative obscurity in Japan. When the war ended, Homma was arrested by American occupation forces and charged with command responsibility for the Bataan Death March and other atrocities committed by troops under his command. His trial by an American military commission began in Manila on January 3, 1946. Like Yamashita's trial, it was presided over by American military officers and conducted with controversial speed. Homma's defense argued that he had been unaware of the specific atrocities committed during the march, that he had issued orders for humane treatment of prisoners, and that the chaos and breakdown of the supply system had been beyond his control. They presented testimony from both Japanese and Allied witnesses, suggesting that Homma had indeed issued orders for proper treatment. The prosecution, however, argued that as commanding general, he bore ultimate responsibility for the actions of his troops, and that he had failed to establish adequate controls to prevent atrocities or to punish those responsible when the crimes became known. On February 11, 1946, Homer was found guilty and sentenced to death by firing squad. Unlike Yamashta, who was hanged, Homer received the military execution he had requested, perhaps a recognition of his status as a professional soldier rather than a political figure. On April 3, 1946, at the age of 58, Masaharu Homer was executed by firing squad outside Manila. His wife, who had travelled from Japan to be near him during the trial, was present and witnessed the execution. In his final statement, Homer maintained that he had ordered humane treatment of prisoners and expressed regret for the suffering that had occurred under his command. The debate over his guilt continues among historians. Some argue that he was genuinely ignorant of the worst atrocities and that he became a scapegoat for systemic failures in the Japanese military's treatment of prisoners. Others contend that as commanding officer, he should have ensured proper treatment and that his failure to investigate reports of mistreatment constituted criminal negligence. What is undeniable is that the Bataan Death March stands as one of the darkest chapters of the Pacific War, and someone had to be held accountable. Iwane Matsui represents yet another complex case where military achievement intersected with horrific war crimes. Born in 1878 in Nagoya, Matsui had a long and distinguished military career spanning 4 decades. He was a China specialist, having served multiple tours in China and developing expertise in Chinese affairs that made him valuable to the Japanese military establishment. He rose through the ranks steadily, becoming a lieutenant general and earning respect for his knowledge and administrative capabilities. In 1933, he was appointed commander of the Taiwan Army, and he retired from active service in 1935. However, retirement would not last long. When the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in July 1937, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japan's military operations in China expanded rapidly. Despite being officially retired, Matsui was recalled to active duty in August 1937 and given command of the Shanghai Expeditionary Army. His mission was to capture Shanghai and punish Chinese forces for their resistance. The Battle of Shanghai turned into a brutal 3-month urban conflict that cost both sides enormous casualties. Chinese forces fought with unexpected determination, and Japanese casualties mounted. When Shanghai finally fell in November 1937, Japanese forces pursued the retreating Chinese army toward Nanking, the capital of nationalist China. Matsui, promoted to command of the Central China Area Army, led the advance on Nanking. The city fell on December 13, 1937, and what followed became known as the Rape of Nanking, one of the most infamous atrocities in modern history. For 6 weeks, Japanese forces engaged in an orgy of violence that shocked the world. Estimates of Chinese civilians and surrendered soldiers killed range from 40,000 to over 300,000. Tens of thousands of women were raped. Widespread looting and arson destroyed much of the city. Foreign witnesses, including American and European missionaries and businessmen who had remained in Nanking, documented the atrocities in photographs, films, and written accounts that later provided evidence of the massacre. The question of Matsui's responsibility for the Nanking massacre has been debated extensively. Matsui was not present in Nanking during the first days of the massacre, having fallen ill during the advance and remaining behind. He entered the city on December 17, 1937, 4 days after its fall, by which time the worst atrocities were already underway. When he learned of the violence, he reportedly expressed anger and ordered his officers to restore discipline. However, critics argue that he did too little too late, and that as commanding officer, he bore ultimate responsibility for failing to prevent the atrocities or to punish those responsible adequately. After the fall of Nanking, Matsui remained in China for a few more months before being recalled to Japan. In early 1938, some historians suggest he was recalled partly as a disciplinary measure due to the Nanking atrocities, though officially he was promoted and given an honorific position. He retired again to private life, spending his final years before Japan's surrender in relative obscurity. When the war ended, American occupation forces arrested Matsui, and he was indicted as a Class A war criminal before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. His trial began in May 1946, along with Tojo and other major figures. Matsui was specifically charged with responsibility for the Nanking atrocities. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the massacre from Chinese witnesses, foreign nationals who had been present, and captured Japanese documents. Matsui's defense argued that he had been ill and absent during the initial outbreak of violence, that he had issued orders to restore discipline once he learned of the situation, and that he could not be held responsible for crimes committed by subordinates acting against his orders. The tribunal was unconvinced. On November 12, 1948, Matsui was found guilty of failing to prevent and punish atrocities committed by troops under his command. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On December 23, 1948, at the age of 70, Iwane Matsui was executed at Sugamo Prison alongside Hideki Tojo and 5 other convicted war criminals. In his final statement, Matsui expressed Buddhist sentiments about the nature of suffering and accepted his fate with resignation. His execution brought a measure of justice for the victims of Nanking, though no punishment could ever truly account for the scale of human suffering inflicted during those terrible 6 weeks in the winter of 1937. Shifting our focus to a different category of Japanese military personnel, we encounter the phenomenon of the stragglers, or holdouts, soldiers who refused to believe the war had ended and continued fighting, sometimes for decades, after the surrender. These men provide a fascinating window into the psychology of the Japanese military and the power of indoctrination. Perhaps the most famous of these holdouts was Hiroo Onoda, whose story captivated the world when he finally emerged from the jungle in 1974, nearly 3 decades after the war's end. Born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Onoda was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942 and trained as an intelligence officer in guerrilla warfare tactics. In December 1944, he was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines with orders to conduct guerrilla operations against Allied forces and to never surrender or commit suicide. His commanding officer's final words to him were allegedly that he would return for Onoda, and until that happened, Onoda was to continue his mission regardless of circumstances. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Onoda and 3 other soldiers on Lubang refused to believe it. They dismissed leaflets dropped from aircraft announcing the war's end as Allied propaganda. Over the years, search parties were sent to find them. Loudspeakers blared announcements and family members came to call out to them. But Onoda and his companions remained hidden in the jungle, convinced these were elaborate tricks. One by one, Onoda's companions were killed in skirmishes with Filipino police or died of natural causes. By 1972, Onoda was alone, still conducting his one-man guerrilla war against an enemy that no longer existed. He had survived by stealing food from local farmers and engaging in occasional firefights with Filipino authorities, killing approximately 30 people over the years in what he believed was continuation of his military duty. What finally brought Onoda out of the jungle was an encounter with Norio Suzuki, a young Japanese adventurer who had come to the Philippines specifically to find Onoda. In February 1974, Suzuki managed to locate Onoda and convince him that the war was truly over, but Onoda insisted he would only surrender, if directly ordered to do so by his former commanding officer. Remarkably, the Japanese government located Onoda's former superior officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who travelled to Lubang Island and on March 9, 1974, formally relieved Onoda of his duties. Onoda, still wearing his tattered uniform and carrying his rifle, which was in perfect working order, finally emerged from the jungle after 29 years. He was 52 years old. When Onoda returned to Japan, he was greeted as both a hero and an anachronism. The Japanese government granted him a pardon for the deaths he had caused in the Philippines, recognizing that he had genuinely believed he was still at war. However, Onoda struggled to adjust to modern Japan, which had transformed completely during his absence. The rigid militaristic society he had known was gone, replaced by a prosperous, democratic, and pacifist nation. Feeling alienated, Onoda eventually moved to Brazil in 1975, where he raised cattle. He did return to Japan periodically and in 1984 established a nature school for young people, hoping to instill some of the survival skills and discipline he had learned. Onoda wrote an autobiography titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War, and became a minor celebrity, giving lectures about his experiences. In 1996, he returned to Lubang Island and donated $10,000 to a local school, expressing his apologies for the deaths he had caused. Hiroo Onoda died in Tokyo on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91. one of the last living symbols of Japan's wartime past, and a man who had literally refused to accept that the war was over. Another remarkable holdout story belongs to Shoichi Yokoy, whose case differed from Onoda's in significant ways. Born in 1915 in Aichi Prefecture, Yokoy was a tailor before being conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1941. He was sent to Guam in 1943 as part of the garrison defending the island. When American forces invaded Guam in July 1944, the battle was fierce, but brief. Within 3 weeks, the island was secured by American forces. However, Yokoy and a small group of Japanese soldiers fled into the jungle rather than surrender. Unlike Onoda, who actively conducted guerrilla warfare, Yokoy and his companions went into hiding and tried to avoid all contact with the outside world. They lived in caves, surviving on a diet of frogs, rats, snails, and whatever plants they could forage. Yokoy became remarkably skilled at survival, making clothing from tree bark, fashioning tools and utensils from scavenged materials, and maintaining an underground dwelling that kept him hidden from American forces and later Guamanian civilians. Over the years, Yokoy's companions either died or left to surrender, and by 1964 he was completely alone. Unlike Onoda, Yokoy actually learned that the war had ended, discovering a leaflet announcing Japan's surrender in 1952. However, he was too ashamed to come out of hiding. In Japanese culture, the shame of surrender was deeply ingrained, and Yokoy felt he could not face his family or his nation after having survived when he should have died in battle. He spent another 20 years in isolation, driven not by military duty but by shame and fear of rejection. On January 24, 1972, 2 local hunters discovered Yokoy checking his shrimp traps in a river. He was 56 years old, emaciated, and dressed in clothes he had woven himself from tree fiber. When captured, Yokoy's first words were reportedly a formal apology to the emperor for having survived. He was repatriated to Japan, where he became an instant celebrity, though his reaction to fame was quite different from Onoda's. While Onoda remained proud of his service and somewhat unrepentant, Yokoy expressed deep shame about his situation. His most famous quote upon returning to Japan was, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." This statement encapsulated the complex psychology of many Japanese soldiers who had been taught that capture and survival were dishonorable. Despite his feelings of shame, Japanese society embraced Yokoy warmly. He married his childhood sweetheart within a few months of his return, appeared on television programs, and became something of a folk hero. He used his fame to promote conservative values and environmental conservation, giving lectures about traditional Japanese virtues and the wasteful nature of modern consumer society. Yokoy even briefly entered politics, though without success. Unlike Onoda, who left Japan, Yokoy remained in his homeland until his death on September 22, 1997, at the age of 82. His story, like Onoda's, served as a reminder of the powerful indoctrination Japanese soldiers received and the difficulty many faced in transitioning from the rigid military culture of wartime Japan to the dramatically different post-war society. The holdout phenomenon was not limited to just Onoda and Yokoy. There were dozens of other Japanese soldiers who remained in hiding for years after the war's end. Some, like Teruo Nakamura, a Taiwanese-born soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, was discovered in Indonesia in 1974, just months after Onoda's surrender. Others were found on various Pacific islands throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Each case revealed the depth of military indoctrination and the psychological impact of Japan's warrior culture. These men had been taught that death was preferable to the dishonor of surrender, that the emperor was divine, and that Japan's war was righteous and must be fought to the end. When reality contradicted these beliefs, many simply could not accept it. Their stories became symbols of both the tragedy of war and the resilience of the human spirit, as well as cautionary tales about the dangers of fanatical devotion to ideology. Returning to the war crimes trials, we must examine the case of Kenji Doihara, sometimes called the Lawrence of Manchuria, for his extensive intelligence and espionage work in China. Born in 1883 in Okayama Prefecture, Doihara joined the Imperial Japanese Army and specialized in intelligence work. He learned to speak fluent Chinese and spent much of his career operating in China, where he became one of Japan's most effective spy masters. Doihara was instrumental in Japan's expansion into Manchuria, orchestrating political intrigues, supporting puppet governments, and facilitating the Japanese military's takeover of the region. In 1931, he played a key role in the Mukden Incident, a false flag operation in which Japanese officers staged an explosion on a railway line as a pretext for the invasion of Manchuria. This incident led directly to Japan's creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932. Doihara's activities went far beyond conventional military operations. He was involved in drug trafficking, using opium sales to fund intelligence operations and to weaken Chinese resistance. He established networks of informants and collaborators throughout northern China. He helped install Puyi, the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty, as the puppet ruler of Manchukuo, giving Japan's occupation a veneer of legitimacy. His methods were often ruthless, involving assassination, blackmail, bribery, and the manipulation of ethnic tensions. During the Second Sino-Japanese War that began in 1937, Doihara held various command positions. He commanded forces in northern China and was promoted to full general in 1941. However, his primary value to the Japanese military establishment remained his intelligence expertise and his deep knowledge of Chinese affairs. As the war turned against Japan, Doihara was appointed commander of the 7th Area Army in Singapore in 1945, a position he held at the time of Japan's surrender. After the war, Doihara was arrested and charged as a Class A war criminal before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The prosecution accused him of conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war against China, and conventional war. Crimes including the torture and murder of prisoners and civilians. The evidence against Doihara was extensive. Prosecutors presented documents linking him to the planning and execution of Japanese aggression in China, to the opium trade that had devastated Chinese communities, and to various atrocities committed by forces under his command or influence. Witnesses testified about his role in establishing the Manchukuo puppet state and his involvement in intelligence operations that violated international law. Doihara's defense argued that he was simply a soldier following orders, that his intelligence work was no different from that conducted by other nations, and that he could not be held responsible for the broader policy decisions of the Japanese government. However, the tribunal found that Doihara had been far more than a mere subordinate following orders. He had been an architect of Japanese aggression in China, an active participant in planning wars of conquest, and complicit in numerous war crimes. On November 12, 1948, Kenji Doihara was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to death by hanging. On December 23, 1948, he was executed at Sugamo Prison alongside Tojo, Matsui, and 4 other convicted war criminals. He was 65 years old. Doihara's case illustrated how intelligence officers and those involved in covert operations could be held accountable for war crimes, establishing precedents that would influence how such personnel were treated in future conflicts. Seishiro Itagaki provides another case study in the intersection of military career and war crimes. Born in 1885 in Iwate Prefecture, Itagaki came from a samurai family and naturally gravitated toward military service. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1904 and served with distinction in various capacities, eventually specializing in intelligence work and China affairs. Like Doihara, Itagaki spent significant time in China and became fluent in Chinese, developing an extensive network of contacts and deep understanding of Chinese politics and society. Itagaki worked closely with Doihara in engineering the Mukden Incident in 1931 and the subsequent Japanese occupation of Manchuria. He served as Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force occupying Manchuria from 1936 to 1937. During this period, he helped consolidate Japanese control over the puppet state of Manchukuo and suppress Chinese resistance with brutal efficiency. In 1938, Itagaki was appointed Minister of War in the Japanese cabinet, a position he held until 1939. In this role, he was instrumental in pushing Japan toward total mobilization for war and in strengthening the military's control over Japanese society. He advocated for aggressive expansion and played a key role in planning operations in China. From 1939 to 1941, he commanded forces in China, and later in the war he commanded the 7th Area Army in Singapore and Malaya from 1945 until Japan's surrender. After The war, Itagaki was arrested and charged as a Class A war criminal. The prosecutors at the Tokyo trials accused him of conspiring to wage aggressive war, waging war against China and other nations, and ordering and permitting war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence included his role in the Mukden incident, his participation in planning Japan's expansion into China and Southeast Asia, and his command responsibility for atrocities committed by Japanese forces in areas under his control. During the trial, Itagaki maintained that Japan's actions had been defensive in nature, forced upon Japan by Western imperialism and Chinese resistance to Japan's legitimate interests in Asia. He argued that he had simply been doing his duty as a soldier. The tribunal rejected these arguments. On November 12, 1948, Itagaki was found guilty and sentenced to death. On December 23, 1948, he was hanged at Sugamo Prison alongside Tojo, Doihara, Matsui, and 3 others. He was 63 years old. Itagaki's execution represented justice for the countless victims of Japanese aggression in China and elsewhere, though like many of the Tokyo trial executions, it also raised questions about selective justice given that Emperor Hirohito, in whose name all these men claimed to act, was never charged. The case of Heitaro Kimura illustrates the fate of those responsible for some of the war's most brutal forced labor projects. Born in 1888 in Tokyo, Kimura had a distinguished military career that saw him rise to the rank of general. He served in various staff and command positions throughout his career, including as Vice Minister of War from 1941 to 1943. However, it was his final assignment that would seal his fate. In 1944, Kimura was appointed commander of the Burma Area Army, responsible for Japanese military operations in Burma and Thailand. It was in this capacity that he oversaw the construction and operation of the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, also known as the Death Railway. This rail line was built to supply Japanese forces in Burma and to provide an alternative supply route to the vulnerable sea lanes. The railway was constructed using forced labour, including Allied prisoners of war and impressed Asian labourers. The conditions were horrific. Workers were driven mercilessly, fed starvation rations, denied medical care, and subjected to brutal punishment for any perceived shirking. They worked in steaming jungles through monsoon rains, plagued by disease, and under the constant threat of violence from their guards. Of the approximately 60,000 Allied POWs who worked on the railway, about 13,000 died. Of the roughly 200,000 to 300,000 Asian forced labourers, estimates suggest that between 80,000 and 100,000 died. The causes of death ranged from malaria, dysentery, cholera, and other diseases to malnutrition, exhaustion, and outright murder by guards. The construction of the railway has been called one of the greatest crimes of the Pacific War, and Kimura, as commander of the Burma Area Army, bore ultimate responsibility. When the war ended, Kimura was arrested and charged before the Tokyo tribunal. The prosecution accused him of command responsibility for the atrocities committed during the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, for the mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war, and for crimes against the civilian populations of Burma and Thailand. Survivors of the Death Railway testified about the conditions they had endured and the deaths they had witnessed. Documents were presented showing that Kimura had been aware of the high death rates among the labourers, but had done nothing to improve conditions. His defence argued that the railway had been a military necessity, that conditions had been difficult for everyone due to the war situation, and that he had not personally ordered the mistreatment of prisoners. However, the evidence of systematic brutality and his failure to intervene, despite clear knowledge of the deaths, proved damning. On November 12, 1948, Kimura was found guilty and sentenced to death. On December 23, 1948, he was hanged at Sugamo Prison. He was 60 years old. The execution brought a measure of justice for the thousands who had died building his railway, though survivors noted that no punishment could truly account for the suffering they had endured. Now we turn to a different aspect of the post-war experience of Japanese soldiers, those who were captured and held in Soviet labor camps. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, and invaded Manchuria, they captured approximately 600,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. Rather than repatriating these prisoners quickly after the war's end, the Soviets transported them to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. The conditions in these camps were brutal. Prisoners were forced to work in mines, forests, and construction projects in extreme cold, often with inadequate food. clothing, and shelter. Thousands died from exposure, disease, malnutrition, and accidents. The exact death toll remains disputed, but estimates range from 60,000 to over 300,000. The Soviets used these prisoners as slave labor to rebuild their war-damaged economy and to develop remote regions. The prisoners were subjected to intense political indoctrination, with the Soviets attempting to convert them to communist ideology. Some prisoners did become convinced communists, and a few even chose to remain in the Soviet Union after being offered repatriation. However, most prisoners simply tried to survive and hoped for eventual return to Japan. The repatriation process was slow and politicized. The Soviets used the Japanese prisoners as bargaining chips in negotiations with Japan and the United States. The first prisoners were not returned until 1946, and the process continued until 1956, with some prisoners spending 11 years in captivity after the war had ended. When the prisoners finally returned to Japan, they faced a difficult adjustment. Many were broken in health, traumatized by their experiences, and struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society. Some faced suspicion due to their exposure to communist indoctrination, particularly during the early Cold War period when anti-communist sentiment was strong in Japan. Their suffering added another layer to the complex story of what happened to Japanese soldiers after the war, demonstrating that defeat brought not just the end of fighting, but years of continued hardship for many. The experience of the ordinary Japanese soldier returning home to Japan itself presents a stark contrast to the dramatic trials and extended captivities. For the millions of soldiers who were in Japan at the time of surrender or who were quickly repatriated from overseas, coming home meant facing a nation in ruins. American bombing had devastated Japan's cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other urban centers had been turned into wastelands by firebombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by atomic weapons. The industrial base was shattered, food was scarce, and millions of civilians were homeless. Into this devastation came millions of demobilized soldiers, men who had to find their place in a society that had changed completely. The military establishment that had dominated Japanese life for decades was gone, dismantled by the American occupation. The values that soldiers had been taught, the loyalty to emperor and nation, the willingness to die rather than surrender, the belief in Japan's special destiny, all of these had been revealed as hollow. The emperor himself had gone on radio to announce that he was not divine, merely human. For men who had been raised to worship him as a living god, this was a profound psychological shock. Many returning soldiers found their families dead, their homes destroyed, their communities scattered. The economic situation was dire, jobs were scarce, and those who had served in the military were not always welcomed back warmly. Some faced resentment from civilians who blamed the military for leading Japan to disaster. Others encountered indifference from a population focused on sheer survival. The American occupation authorities implemented demilitarization policies that banned military veterans from many government positions and teaching jobs, limiting employment opportunities. Some former soldiers turned to black market activities to survive, becoming part of the criminal underworld that flourished in the chaos of post-war Japan. Others struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though such concepts were not well understood at the time. Alcoholism, depression, and suicide were common among veterans. However, as Japan began to recover in the late 1940s and 1950s, many veterans did successfully reintegrate. The Korean War brought unexpected economic benefits to Japan as American forces used Japan as a supply base, jump-starting industrial recovery. As the economy improved, employment opportunities increased. Many veterans applied their discipline and work ethic to rebuilding Japan's economy, and some became successful businessmen or public servants in the new democratic Japan. By the 1960s, as Japan entered its period of rapid economic growth, the wartime generation of soldiers had largely found their place in the new society, though they carried the scars of their experiences for the rest of their lives. But what became of those who had committed the worst atrocities? Beyond the high-profile trials in Tokyo and Manila, there were numerous other war crimes proceedings conducted by various allied nations. The British conducted trials in Singapore, Hong Kong, and other locations for crimes committed in Southeast Asia. The Australians held trials for crimes committed against Australian POWs and in areas under Australian military administration. The Chinese conducted trials for crimes committed in China. The Dutch prosecuted those responsible for crimes in the Netherlands East Indies. These trials resulted in thousands of convictions. Some were sentenced to death and executed. Others received long prison sentences. The sentences varied widely depending on the specific crimes, the evidence available, the attitudes of the prosecuting nation, and sometimes simply the luck of which court system a defendant ended up in. There were also many who escaped justice entirely. Some war criminals managed to hide their identities and disappear into civilian life. Others were shielded by the changing political situation. As the Cold War emerged, American occupation authorities became more interested in rebuilding Japan as an ally against communism than in pursuing every war criminal. This led to some controversial decisions, including the early release of some convicted war criminals and the decision not to prosecute others who might have been useful in the anti-communist struggle. One particularly controversial example was the case of Shiro Ishii and the members of Unit 731. Ishii, born in 1892 in Chiba Prefecture, was a microbiologist and army medical officer who established a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit in Manchuria. Unit 731 conducted horrific experiments on living human subjects, mostly Chinese prisoners and civilians, but also some Allied POWs. These experiments included vivisection without anesthesia, testing of biological weapons, exposure to extreme cold to study frostbite, forced infections with deadly diseases, and numerous other atrocities that rivaled anything done in Nazi concentration camps. Thousands of victims died in these experiments. Unit 731 also conducted biological warfare attacks against Chinese cities, releasing plague-infected fleas that killed thousands of civilians. When Japan surrendered, Ishii ordered the destruction of the facilities and the murder of the remaining prisoners to hide evidence of Unit 731's activities. However, American occupation authorities learned about the unit's research. Faced with a choice between prosecuting Ishii and his colleagues for war crimes or gaining access to their research data, the Americans made a controversial decision. They granted Ishii and his key subordinates immunity from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure of their research findings. The Americans wanted this data both for its potential military applications and to keep it out of Soviet hands. As a result, Ishii and most of his colleagues were never prosecuted for their crimes. Ishii lived quietly in Tokyo after the war, working as a medical practitioner, and died of throat cancer in 1959 at the age of 67, never having faced justice for the thousands he had murdered in the name of science. The deal that protected him remained classified for decades, and when it finally became public knowledge, it sparked outrage and highlighted the moral compromises made during the early Cold War. The victims of Unit 731 never received justice, and Ishii's escape from prosecution remains one of the most controversial aspects of post-war justice in Asia. Another category of Japanese soldiers who faced unique circumstances after the war were those who had fought alongside Axis allies far from the Pacific theatre. Some Japanese military personnel had been stationed in Europe, working with German and Italian forces. Others had been in the Indian Ocean region, cooperating with German U-boats or supporting anti-British movements in India. These soldiers often had difficulty getting home after the surrender. Some spent years in displacement, moving from one temporary location to another before finally being repatriated to Japan. Their experiences varied widely depending on where they were when the war ended and which Allied power took them into custody. Their stories add to the complexity of understanding what happened to Japanese soldiers after World War II, demonstrating that there was no single narrative but rather millions of individual stories of survival, punishment, return, and attempted reconstruction of lives in a transformed world. Moving to the case of Koki Hirota, we encounter the only civilian member of the Japanese government to be executed as a war criminal. Born in 1878 in Fukuoka, Hirota had pursued a career in diplomacy rather than the military. He served as Japan's ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1930 to 1932, and then as foreign minister from 1933 to 1936. In 1936, he became Prime Minister of Japan, a position he held until 1937. During his time as Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, Japan's military expansion in China accelerated. Hirota was involved in negotiating the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany in 1936, which laid the groundwork for Japan's alignment with the Axis powers. After serving as Prime Minister, he returned to the position of Foreign Minister from 1937 to 1938, under Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. It was during this period that the Nanking massacre occurred. Although Hirota was not a military commander and had no direct role in the atrocities, he was foreign minister when reports of the massacre reached Tokyo through diplomatic channels. Foreign ambassadors and journalists reported the atrocities to the Japanese government, and Hirota received these reports. The question that would determine his fate was what, if anything, he did in response to these reports. When Hirota was arrested after the war and charged before the Tokyo tribunal, the prosecution accused him of failing to take action to stop the atrocities at Nanking, despite having knowledge of them. They argued that as foreign minister, he had both the knowledge and the authority to bring the matter to the cabinet and demand action, but he had failed to do so. The prosecution also charged him with conspiracy to wage aggressive war and with general responsibility for Japan's actions given his senior government positions. Hirota's defense argued that as a civilian diplomat, he had no authority over military operations, and that the military had dominated the government to such an extent that civilian ministers were powerless to restrain them. They contended that Hirota had actually been a moderate who had tried to restrain the military's ambitions, and that he should not be held responsible for the actions of generals and soldiers over whom he had no control. The tribunal's verdict was controversial. On November 12, 1948, Hirota was found guilty and sentenced to death. The decision was not unanimous. Several of the judges argued that Hirota should not receive the death penalty, and some questioned whether he should be convicted at all given his civilian status and limited authority. However, the majority concluded that his failure to act on knowledge of the Nanking atrocities, combined with his role in Japan's diplomatic preparation for war, made him culpable. On December 23, 1948, Koki Hirota was hanged at Sugamo prison alongside the military leaders. He was 70 years old and the only civilian executed after the Tokyo trials. His execution remains debated by historians, with some viewing it as appropriate punishment for complicity in war crimes and others seeing it as unjust victimization of a civilian who had limited power in a military-dominated government. His case highlighted the complex question of responsibility in authoritarian regimes, where civilian government officials may have formal positions but limited actual authority. The story of Japanese naval officers after the war presents its own unique narrative. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been one of the most powerful naval forces in the world before the war, with massive battleships like the Yamato and Musashi, numerous aircraft carriers, and thousands of skilled officers and sailors. By war's end, this formidable fleet had been almost completely destroyed. Most of the major warships had been sunk and surviving vessels were in poor condition. When Japan surrendered, the remaining ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy were seized by Allied forces, and the Navy was completely disbanded. Naval officers faced many of the same challenges as their Army counterparts, but they also dealt with the specific loss of the service that had defined their identities. The Navy had been more cosmopolitan and less ideologically extreme than the Army, and many naval officers had opposed going to war with the United States, recognizing that Japan could not win a protracted naval conflict. Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had himself warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year, but could not win a long war. His prediction had proven tragically accurate. Those naval officers who survived the war generally faced fewer war crimes charges than army officers, partly because naval warfare was more conventional and less likely to result in the kind of atrocities common in land campaigns. However, there were exceptions. Some submarine commanders and naval guards at POW camps were prosecuted for war crimes. One significant case involved the practice of executing survivors from sunken ships. Some Japanese submarine and surface ship commanders had engaged in this practice, machine gunning lifeboats or leaving survivors to drown rather than taking them prisoner. These actions violated international laws of naval warfare and resulted in several prosecutions. The defense typically argued that submarines could not carry prisoners and that surfacing to rescue survivors would expose the submarine to attack. However, the systematic nature of some executions, including documented cases where unarmed survivors in lifeboats were deliberately targeted, made such defenses untenable in many cases. Officers found guilty of these crimes received sentences ranging from imprisonment to execution, depending on the specific circumstances and the court that tried them. Most naval officers, however, returned to civilian life without facing legal proceedings. Many struggled to find their place in a Japan without a navy. Some went into maritime industries, becoming merchant marine officers or working in shipbuilding and shipping companies. Others left the sea entirely, entering different fields. As Japan rebuilt and eventually established the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force in 1954, some former Imperial Navy officers found new careers in this organization, though it was constitutionally limited to defensive operations and was a fraction of the size of the old Imperial Navy. The transition from the proud officers of a great naval power to civilians in a defeated, occupied nation was psychologically difficult for many, but like other Japanese veterans, most eventually adapted to the new reality. Attention must also be given to those Japanese soldiers who ended up fighting in other conflicts after World War II ended. While most Japanese soldiers simply wanted to return home and rebuild their lives, some found themselves drawn into the turmoil of post-war Asia. In China, the civil war between the communists and nationalists resumed almost immediately after Japan's defeat. Both sides sought to co-opt surrendered Japanese soldiers for their own purposes. The communists in particular recruited Japanese soldiers who had technical expertise in areas like artillery, aviation, and medical care. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, unable to return home immediately and sometimes attracted by communist ideology, fought alongside Chinese communist forces. Some served as advisors and instructors, training Chinese troops in modern military techniques. Others actually participated in combat operations. When the communists won the Civil War in 1949, many of these Japanese veterans remained in China, some by choice and others because they were not permitted to leave. Over time, most were eventually repatriated to Japan, though some remained in China for decades. Their service with the communists was controversial in Japan, where they were sometimes viewed as traitors, though others saw them as men who had simply tried to survive in impossible circumstances. In Indonesia, a different dynamic played out. When Japan surrendered, Indonesia declared independence from Dutch colonial rule. The returning Dutch sought to reassert control, leading to the Indonesian National Revolution that lasted from 1945 to 1949. Approximately 2,000 Japanese soldiers who had been stationed in Indonesia chose to stay and fight alongside Indonesian independence forces rather than surrender to the Allies or return to Japan. Their motivations varied. Some genuinely supported Indonesian independence, having developed sympathy for nationalist movements during the occupation. Others saw it as a way to continue fighting against Western imperialism. Some simply wanted adventure or felt they had nothing to return to in devastated Japan. These Japanese volunteers fought in various capacities, some as combat troops, others as instructors training Indonesian forces. They used weapons left behind by the Japanese military and employed tactics learned from years of jungle warfare. When Indonesia achieved independence in 1949, some of these Japanese soldiers were granted Indonesian citizenship and remained in the country. Others eventually returned to Japan. Their story represents an unusual chapter in the post-war narrative, demonstrating that for some Japanese soldiers, the war's end was not the end of their military service. In Vietnam, a similar pattern emerged. Some Japanese soldiers stayed in French Indochina and became involved with the Viet Minh independence movement. They provided training and technical expertise to Vietnamese forces fighting against French colonial rule. A few even participated in the First Indochina War that culminated in the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. These Japanese volunteers saw themselves as continuing the fight against Western colonialism in Asia, completing the mission of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere that Japan had nominally fought for, albeit now without the Japanese Empire behind them. Like those who fought in Indonesia and China, these men represented a tiny fraction of Japanese soldiers, but their stories illustrate the complexity and diversity of post-war experiences. The psychological impact of defeat and occupation on Japanese soldiers cannot be overstated. An entire generation of men had been raised to believe in Japan's invincibility, the divinity of the emperor, and the righteousness of their cause. The sudden and total defeat shattered these beliefs. The emperor's announcement of surrender, delivered in his own voice over radio for the first time, used archaic court language that many common soldiers could barely understand. But the message was clear. Japan had lost. Some soldiers committed suicide rather than accept surrender. On the day of the surrender announcement, hundreds of officers and soldiers took their own lives. Some performed ritual seppuku in the traditional samurai manner. Others shot themselves. Small groups of soldiers attacked American personnel or attempted futile final attacks, choosing death in battle over the shame of surrender. However, most soldiers, despite their training and indoctrination, chose to live. They surrendered their weapons, returned to their families if they could, and tried to build new lives. The occupation by American forces, which many had expected to be brutal, turned out to be relatively benign. The Americans focused on demilitarization and democratization, but did not engage in widespread reprisals against the Japanese population. This relatively lenient occupation helped Japanese soldiers reintegrate into society, as they were not treated as pariahs by the occupying power. Nevertheless, the psychological scars remained. Many veterans struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when so many of their comrades had died. Others grappled with the realization that the values they had fought for were now condemned. The military virtues of loyalty, obedience, and self-sacrifice were suddenly portrayed as the dangerous elements of a militaristic culture that had led Japan to disaster. Veterans had to navigate a society that was rapidly embracing pacifism and democracy, values that seemed antithetical to everything they had been taught. Some veterans formed associations to preserve their memories and maintain contact with fellow soldiers. These groups provided social support and a space where former soldiers could talk about their experiences without judgment. However, these associations were sometimes controversial, with critics arguing that they glorified Japan's wartime actions and failed to acknowledge Japanese atrocities. The controversy around the Yasukuni Shrine, which honors Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, became a focal point for these tensions. Many veterans visited the shrine to honor fallen comrades, seeing it as a matter of remembering the dead rather than endorsing militarism. However, for many Asian neighbors and even many Japanese, visits to Yasukuni by public figures represented a disturbing failure to fully acknowledge and atone for wartime crimes. As the decades passed, Japanese society's relationship with its wartime past remained complex and often contentious. Some veterans wrote memoirs attempting to record their experiences for future generations. These accounts varied widely in tone and content. Some were straightforward military histories focusing on tactics and battles. Others delved into the moral complexities of their service, grappling with questions of responsibility and guilt. A few were apologetic, expressing remorse for Japan's actions. Others were unapologetic, defending Japan's war and portraying veterans as patriots who had served their country honorably. The diversity of these narratives reflected the lack of consensus in Japanese society about how to remember the war. Unlike Germany, which underwent extensive denazification and developed a strong culture of remembrance and atonement for the Holocaust, Japan's reckoning with its wartime past was more ambiguous. The decision not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito, the retention of many pre-war elites in positions of power, and the early end of the occupation all contributed to a less complete transformation than occurred in Germany. As a result, Japanese veterans found themselves in a society that sent mixed messages about their service. On one hand, they were told that Japan had been wrong to wage aggressive war and commit atrocities. On the other hand, they were part of a generation that had rebuilt Japan into an economic powerhouse, and their discipline and work ethic were often credited with this success. The fate of Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, deserves special attention. The Kempeitai served as the military police force of the Imperial Japanese Army and operated throughout Japanese-occupied territories. They were responsible for maintaining military discipline, but they also engaged in intelligence work, counter-espionage, and the suppression of resistance movements. In occupied territories, the Kempeitai became notorious for their brutal methods, including torture, summary executions, and the operation of secret prisons. They were feared throughout Asia for their ruthlessness and their extensive network of informants. After Japan's surrender, Kempeitai personnel were particular targets for arrest and prosecution. Allied authorities viewed them as analogous to the Nazi Gestapo, and many were charged with war crimes. The evidence against Kempeitai officers was often overwhelming, with numerous witnesses testifying about torture, murder, and other atrocities. Thousands of Kempeitai members were tried by various Allied military tribunals. Many were convicted and executed, or, imprisoned. The range of their crimes was extensive, from the torture of prisoners to involvement in massacres of civilians to the operation of brutal POW camps. However, the prosecution of Kempeitai personnel was uneven. High-ranking officers were more likely to face trial, while lower-ranking members sometimes escaped justice by hiding their service or being overlooked in the chaos of post-war occupation. Some Kempeitai officers who escaped prosecution attempted to blend back into civilian life, though their past sometimes caught up with them years later when former victims recognized them or documents surfaced proving their involvement in crimes. The controversy surrounding Class B and Class C war criminals provides insight into the broader questions of justice after the war. While Class A criminals were those charged with crimes against peace and planning aggressive war, Class B criminals were those charged with conventional war crimes, and Class C criminals were lower ranking, individuals charged with specific acts of brutality. The trials of Class B and C criminals numbered in the thousands and were conducted by various Allied powers in different locations throughout Asia. These trials varied greatly in their fairness and rigour. Some were conducted with careful attention to evidence and due process. Others were hasty proceedings where the accused had little opportunity to mount effective defences. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the passion of the immediate post-war period all contributed to irregularities. Some defendants were clearly guilty of horrific crimes and deserved punishment. Others may have been convicted on insufficient evidence or held responsible for actions they did not commit or could not have prevented. The quality of legal representation varied dramatically. Some defendants had skilled lawyers who mounted vigorous defences. Others had inexperienced or overwhelmed counsel who could do little to help them. Approximately 5,700 Japanese military personnel were charged in these trials, with roughly 4,400 convicted. Of those convicted, about 920 were executed, and the remainder sentenced to various terms of imprisonment. These numbers, while significant, represented only a fraction of those who had committed war crimes. Many guilty individuals were never prosecuted, either because they were not identified, evidence was lacking, witnesses were unavailable, or prosecuting authorities lacked the resources to pursue every case. The imperfect nature of post-war justice meant that some who deserved punishment escaped it, while questions lingered about whether all those who were punished received fair trials. Another significant group whose fate deserves examination consists of the Japanese soldiers who were technical specialists, scientists, and engineers. Japan had developed advanced capabilities in various military technologies, and Allied powers were interested in capturing this knowledge and the people who possessed it. Aircraft designers, naval architects, radar specialists, and various other technical personnel were often interrogated extensively by Allied intelligence officers seeking to understand Japanese technological developments. Some of this technical expertise was transferred to Allied militaries, contributing to post-war military development. Unlike the scientists of Unit 731 who received immunity for their crimes, most technical specialists had not been involved in atrocities and simply provided information about conventional military technology. Many of these individuals later found work in Japan's rebuilding industries, applying their technical skills to civilian purposes. Japanese aircraft designers worked on early civilian aircraft projects. Naval architects contributed to Japan's merchant marine reconstruction. The transition from military to civilian technical work was often easier for these specialists than for combat soldiers, as their skills were more directly transferable, and they had usually not been involved in the kind of combat experiences that left psychological scars. The Kamicazi pilots present a unique and tragic subset of Japanese military personnel. These young men, many barely out of their teens, had volunteered or been assigned to fly suicide missions against Allied ships. The Kamicazi Corps represented the ultimate expression of the Japanese military's willingness to sacrifice individual lives for the collective cause. By the war's end, thousands of young men had been trained as kamikaze pilots, though not all had the opportunity to fly their final missions before the surrender. Those who survived faced a complex psychological burden. They had prepared themselves for death, said farewell to their families, written final letters, and steeled themselves to die for the Emperor and Japan. When the war ended, they found themselves alive, but adrift. Some felt guilt that they had survived when so many of their comrades had died. Others struggled with the realization that their intended sacrifice had been for a lost cause. The kamikaze pilots who survived generally did not face war crimes charges, as their planned attacks on military targets were considered legitimate acts of war, however desperate and extreme. They returned to civilian life carrying the weight of having been prepared to die and the confusion of having to live instead. Many never spoke about their experiences, finding it too painful or too difficult to explain to those who had not shared the experience. Some eventually wrote memoirs or gave interviews later in life, providing valuable insight into the psychology of the kamikaze phenomenon. Their accounts often expressed the conflict between their continued reverence for fallen comrades and their recognition that the cause they had been prepared to die for had been flawed or wrong. The experience of Korean and Taiwanese soldiers who had served in the Imperial Japanese Army adds another layer of complexity to the post-war story. During Japan's colonial rule of Korea and Taiwan, men from these territories were conscripted into Japanese military service. At the war's end, these soldiers faced a unique predicament. They were not Japanese citizens returning to Japan, but colonial subjects whose homelands were transitioning away from Japanese rule. Korean soldiers found themselves in a particularly difficult position. The Korean peninsula was divided into Soviet and American occupation zones that would eventually become North and South Korea. Those in the north came under communist rule, while those in the south entered the American sphere of influence. Some Korean soldiers who had served Japan were viewed with suspicion or hostility by their fellow Koreans, seen as collaborators with the colonial oppressor. This was especially true for those who had served in police or security roles that involved suppressing Korean resistance to Japanese rule. Many tried to hide their service records and blend back into civilian life quietly. The situation for Taiwanese soldiers was somewhat different. Taiwan was transferred from Japanese to Chinese nationalist control in 1945. Former Japanese military personnel faced an uncertain future under the new regime. Some were able to integrate into the new society without major difficulties. Others faced discrimination or suspicion. Both Korean and Taiwanese veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army often found that their service, rather than being honoured as it might be in other countries, was a source of shame or at least something to be kept quiet. This created a hidden population of veterans whose experiences were largely unacknowledged for decades. The American occupation of Japan, which lasted from 1945 to 1952, profoundly shaped the experiences of Japanese soldiers after the war. General Douglas MacArthur, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, wielded enormous authority and made crucial decisions about Japan's future. The occupation authorities implemented sweeping reforms designed to demilitarize and democratize Japan. The 1947 Constitution, written largely by American officials, included Article 9, which renounced war as a sovereign right and prohibited Japan from maintaining military forces. This effectively meant that Japanese soldiers could never again serve in a traditional military capacity, at least not legally. The occupation also implemented purges of military personnel from public life. Those who had held ranks above a certain level or positions of significant authority were banned from government service, teaching, and other influential positions. This affected tens of thousands of former officers who found their career prospects severely limited. The purges were eventually relaxed and then ended, but they had a significant impact during the late 1940s. Paradoxically, as the Cold War intensified and the communist victory in China made East Asia a focal point of US-Soviet rivalry, American policy toward Japan shifted. The focus moved from punishment and reform to rebuilding Japan as a bulwark against communism. This shift led to the early release of some imprisoned war criminals, the end of war crimes trials, and a de-emphasis on Japan's wartime actions. In 1954, Japan established the Japan Self-Defense Forces, a military in all but name, circumventing the constitutional prohibition through careful language and limited mission parameters. Some former Imperial Japanese Army and Navy officers found new careers in these forces, though the SDF was carefully designed to be defensive in nature and small in size compared to the old military. This evolution in occupation policy from punishment to partnership reflected broader geopolitical realities, but also meant that Japan's reckoning with its wartime past was incomplete. The role of Emperor Hirohito in the post-war narrative deserves examination, as his fate directly impacted how Japanese soldiers understood their own service and sacrifice. Hirohito had reigned since 1926, and in whose name all military operations had been conducted. The question of whether to charge him as a war criminal was seriously debated among the Allies. Many, particularly in Australia and other nations that had suffered Japanese occupation, wanted to see Hirohito tried and punished. However, General MacArthur concluded that prosecuting the emperor would be counterproductive, potentially destabilizing Japan and making the occupation much more difficult. MacArthur believed that retaining Hirohito would provide continuity and help maintain order during the transition. The emperor's broadcast announcing surrender had been obeyed by the military, demonstrating his authority. MacArthur also calculated that putting the emperor on trial might provoke widespread resistance and could even lead to guerrilla warfare that would require a much larger occupation force and cost many lives. Consequently, the decision was made to shield Hirohito from prosecution. Witnesses were coached to exonerate the emperor, and the narrative promoted by occupation authorities portrayed Hirohito as a ceremonial figure who had been manipulated by militarists rather than an active participant in the decision to wage war. This decision had profound implications for how Japanese soldiers understood their service. If the emperor, in whose name they had fought, was not culpable, then what did that say about their own responsibility? The preservation of the emperor allowed Japan to maintain some continuity with its past, while officially condemning militarism. Hirohito remained on the throne until his death in 1989, a living connection to the war years and a constant reminder of Japan's complex relationship with its history. The phenomenon of Japanese war brides introduces an unusual dimension to the post-war narrative. Thousands of Japanese women married American servicemen during the occupation and moved to the United States. While not soldiers themselves, many of these women were relatives of soldiers, often from military families. Their departure for America created complex family situations. Fathers and brothers who had fought against America watched their daughters and sisters marry former enemies and leave Japan. These marriages represented both personal connections across the former battle lines and a pragmatic recognition that the world had changed. For Japanese military families, having a daughter marry an American could be seen as either a betrayal or an adaptation to new realities. These women faced significant challenges in America, dealing with racism, cultural differences, and the hostility that many Americans still felt toward Japanese people. Their stories add nuance to the simple narrative of victors and vanquished, showing how personal relationships could transcend national enmities. The treatment of Japanese POWs by the Soviets remains one of the darker chapters of the post-war period and merits deeper examination. Beyond the forced labor mentioned earlier, Soviet treatment of Japanese prisoners involved systematic brutality and political manipulation. The Soviets conducted intensive interrogation of prisoners, seeking military intelligence and attempting to identify potential war criminals. Some prisoners were singled out for particularly harsh treatment based on their ranks or units. Officers were often separated from enlisted men and subjected to more intense indoctrination efforts. The Soviets were particularly interested in converting officers to communism, believing they could be useful in spreading communist influence in post-war Japan. The conditions in the camps were deliberately harsh. Prisoners worked long hours in extreme cold with inadequate food, clothing and shelter. Malnutrition was widespread and disease was common. Medical care was minimal. The Soviets used a combination of physical hardship and political education to break down prisoners' resistance and reshape their thinking. Some prisoners did convert to communism, genuinely believing in the ideology or simply recognizing that cooperation might improve their treatment or chances of repatriation. These individuals were formed into special groups and given better conditions. They were expected to spread communist propaganda among other prisoners and were promised early repatriation. When prisoners were finally returned to Japan, those who had been identified as communist sympathizers often faced suspicion and social ostracism. Some had genuinely adopted communist beliefs and continued to promote them in Japan, joining the Japanese Communist Party or related organizations. Others had only feigned conversion to survive and quickly abandoned these pretenses once safely home. The experience of Soviet captivity left deep scars on those who endured it, and the slow pace of repatriation meant that families in Japan spent years not knowing if their loved ones were alive or would ever return. The war crimes trial system, while focused on major figures in Tokyo and Manila, also included numerous smaller trials throughout Asia. Each Allied nation that had been occupied or attacked by Japan conducted its own trials. The British held trials in Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, and other locations. The Dutch tried Japanese personnel in Indonesia. The French conducted trials in Indochina. The Australians held trials in various Pacific locations. The Chinese conducted extensive trials for crimes committed in China. The Philippines prosecuted those responsible for crimes on Filipino soil. The Americans conducted trials beyond those in Tokyo and Manila, including trials in various Pacific islands. Each of these jurisdictions had its own procedures, standards of evidence, and sentencing guidelines. This led to significant inconsistencies in how justice was administered. An individual might receive a death sentence in one jurisdiction for crimes that might result in a prison term in another. The lack of uniform standards was a source of criticism, though defenders of the system argued that allowing each victimized nation to conduct trials was appropriate given the scale and geographic spread of Japanese crimes. Some defendants were tried multiple times by different jurisdictions for related crimes, raising questions about double jeopardy. Others were tried only once, or not at all, depending on which authority apprehended them and whether that authority chose to prosecute. The overall result was a patchwork system that delivered rough justice but fell short of the systematic thoroughness some had hoped for. Japanese military traditions and their post-war legacy present an interesting area of examination. The samurai code of Bushido, with its emphasis on loyalty, honor, self-discipline, and acceptance of death, had been appropriated and distorted by the military to justify extreme behavior including suicide attacks, brutal treatment of prisoners, and refusal to surrender. After the war, there was significant debate about these traditions. Some argued that Bushido and other military traditions were inherently militaristic and had contributed to Japan's aggressive behavior. Others contended that the military had corrupted traditional values and that true Bushido was about moral integrity and discipline, not blind obedience and cruelty. Veterans themselves held diverse views on this question. Some rejected military traditions entirely, seeing them as having led Japan astray. Others maintained that there was value in traditional martial virtues if properly understood and separated from militarism. This debate played out in literature, film, and public discourse throughout the post-war period. Many of the great Japanese films of the 1950s and 1960s grappled with questions of what it meant to be a warrior in a pacifist society, how to honor the dead without glorifying war, and how traditional values could be preserved while rejecting militarism. The experiences of Japanese soldiers who had been stationed in China during the war varied enormously, depending on when and where they served and what they witnessed or participated in. Those who had been part of the initial invasions in the 1930s, who had witnessed or taken part in atrocities like the rape of Nanking, carried particularly heavy burdens. Some acknowledged their crimes and expressed genuine remorse. A few became vocal advocates for peace and reconciliation, speaking publicly about what they had done and witnessed. These individuals often faced ostracism from other veterans who felt they were betraying their comrades or besmirching Japan's honor. However, they believed that acknowledging the truth was essential for preventing future wars and for making amends to the victims. Other veterans of the China campaigns remained silent about their experiences, either from shame, from fear of prosecution, or from a belief that talking about such things served no purpose. Many simply wanted to forget and move on with their lives. Still others denied that atrocities had occurred or minimized their scale, maintaining that reports of Japanese crimes were exaggerated Allied propaganda. This diversity of response among China campaign veterans reflected broader divisions in Japanese society about how to remember and interpret the war. The Medical Corps of the Imperial Japanese Army presents its own troubling legacy. Beyond the monstrous experiments of Unit 731, military doctors throughout the Japanese forces had been involved in various ethically questionable or outright criminal activities. Medical experiments on prisoners, inadequate care for POWs, participation in biological warfare programs, and complicity in the brutal treatment of comfort women all implicated medical personnel in war crimes. After the war, some military doctors faced prosecution for their actions. However, many escaped justice either through lack of evidence, the immunity deals like that, given to Unit 731 personnel, or simply by hiding their military service and returning to civilian medical practice. The presence of former military doctors in post-war Japanese medicine, some of whom had committed atrocities, raised troubling questions about accountability and professional ethics. Some medical organizations in Japan have been criticized for not adequately addressing the war crimes committed by doctors during the war. The case of military medical personnel illustrated how professional expertise could be perverted to serve criminal ends, and how difficult it was to achieve comprehensive justice after the war. The comfort women system, while not directly related to combat soldiers, intersected with the military's post-war experience in significant ways. The sexual slavery system that Japan had operated throughout its empire had involved the cooperation of many military personnel in recruiting, transporting, and guarding the women forced into this system. After the war, most of the records of the comfort women system were destroyed, and for decades the Japanese government denied its involvement. Soldiers who had knowledge of or participated in the system generally remained silent, contributing to the cover-up. It was not until the 1990s that surviving comfort women began speaking out publicly, and documentary evidence emerged proving the military's systematic involvement. When the truth became undeniable, it reignited debates about Japan's wartime conduct and about the complicity of ordinary soldiers in atrocities. Many veterans who had known about the comfort women system but had never spoken up found themselves facing questions about why they had remained silent for so long. The comfort women issue became one of the most contentious aspects of Japan's wartime legacy, souring relations with South Korea and other Asian nations, and demonstrating how wartime crimes could have repercussions decades after the fact. The children of Japanese soldiers who had been born in occupied territories presented difficult situations after the war. In countries like China, Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere, Japanese soldiers had fathered children with local women, sometimes through consensual relationships, but often through rape or coerced relationships. When Japan was defeated and soldiers returned home, these children were often left behind. They grew up as mixed-race children in societies that often discriminated against them, bearing the stigma of Japanese ancestry in nations that had suffered under Japanese occupation. Most of these children never knew their fathers or had any connection to Japan. In some cases, Japanese veterans later tried to locate children they had fathered, with varying degrees of success and widely different outcomes. Some children wanted nothing to do with fathers who had abandoned them. Others were curious about their Japanese heritage. The stories of these forgotten children of war added another dimension to the human cost of Japan's imperial expansion. Looking at the broader pattern of how different types of soldiers fared after the war reveals striking variations. High-ranking officers were most likely to face war crimes charges, with those who had commanded forces that committed major atrocities facing the harshest penalties. Mid-level officers had mixed fates, some prosecuted if linked to specific crimes, others able to return to civilian life without legal consequences. Enlisted men were least likely to face prosecution unless they had committed particularly egregious individual acts or served in notorious units like the Kempei Tai. Technical specialists and support personnel generally avoided prosecution and often found their skills valued in post-war reconstruction. This pattern reflected both practical limitations, as prosecutors could not try everyone, and focused on those most responsible, and a hierarchical view of responsibility that placed greater culpability on commanders than on those following orders. The question of how Japanese society should remember its war dead became increasingly contentious over the decades. Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo had been established in 1869 to honor those who died serving the emperor. After World War II, it became the primary site for memorializing Japan's war dead, eventually enshrining approximately 2.5 million souls, including those from World War II. The controversial decision to include Class A war criminals among those enshrined in 1978 turned Yasukuni into a flashpoint for debates about Japanese militarism and accountability. When Japanese prime ministers or other officials visited the shrine, it provoked outrage from China, South Korea, and other nations that had been victimized by Japanese aggression, as well as from many Japanese who felt such visits honored war criminals. Defenders of visits to Yasukuni argued that they were simply honoring the war dead and that all nations honor their fallen soldiers, regardless of whether the wars they fought in were just. Critics countered that enshrining war criminals alongside ordinary soldiers conflated legitimate memorial with glorification of aggression, and that it was insensitive to the victims of Japanese crimes. Veterans themselves were divided on this issue, with some regarding Yasukuni as sacred ground where their fallen comrades were honored, and others uncomfortable with the shrine's association with unrepentant militarism. As the decades passed and the generation that had fought the war began to age and die, the urgency of dealing with war crimes accusations diminished. but never entirely disappeared. Occasionally, elderly former soldiers would be identified as having participated in atrocities, sometimes by historians uncovering documents, sometimes by survivors recognizing them. These belated accusations were difficult to prosecute given the time that had passed, the deaths of many witnesses, and the age and health of the accused. However, they served as reminders that the war's moral accounting remained incomplete. Some accused former soldiers confessed and apologized for their actions, seeking some measure of peace in their final years. Others denied the accusations or claimed not to remember. A few faced legal proceedings, though convictions were rare given the evidentiary challenges. The persistence of these cases into the 21st century illustrated how the legacy of the war continued to haunt Japan and its Asian neighbors long after the last shots were fired. The economic miracle that Japan experienced from the 1950s through the 1980s provided a form of redemption for many veterans. They could take pride in having helped rebuild Japan into one of the world's most prosperous and advanced nations. The discipline, work ethic, and group solidarity that had characterized military service found new application in building corporate powerhouses and developing cutting-edge technology. Some scholars have argued that Japan's post-war economic success was partly built on the same organizational capabilities and cultural values that had made its military so formidable during the war, now redirected toward peaceful and productive ends. Veterans could see themselves as having contributed to a better Japan, even if the path to that contribution had been through a terrible and misguided war. This economic success also helped Japan regain international respect and move beyond its identity as a defeated aggressor nation. However, critics noted that economic success should not obscure moral accounting, and that Japan's failure to fully confront its wartime actions remained a problem, despite its post-war achievements. The cultural representation of soldiers in Japanese media evolved significantly over the post-war decades. Immediately after the war, Japanese cinema under occupation censorship portrayed militarism negatively and emphasized the suffering that the war had brought to Japan. As the occupation ended and Japan regained sovereignty, films began to explore more complex portrayals. Some films depicted soldiers sympathetically as victims of militaristic leaders and impossible situations. Others examined the moral corruption that war could produce. The films of directors like Akira Kurosawa often included characters struggling with questions of duty, honor, and the aftermath of violence. By the 1960s and 1970s, some films began to portray Japanese soldiers more heroically, though usually focusing on their courage and suffering rather than celebrating the wars they had fought. By the 1990s and 2000s, as the veterans themselves were dying off and direct memory of the war was fading, some Japanese media began to portray World War II in ways that troubled critics who felt they minimized Japanese aggression and atrocities. The evolution of cultural representations reflected changing Japanese attitudes toward the war and toward the generation that had fought it. The process of repatriation, itself beyond those held by the Soviets, involved enormous logistical challenges. Approximately 6.5 million Japanese military personnel and civilians were scattered across Asia and the Pacific at the war's end. Bringing them all home required a massive effort by both Allied authorities and the Japanese government. Soldiers were gathered at collection points, processed, and then transported by ship back to Japan. The journey home could take months depending on where someone was starting from. Ships were often overcrowded, conditions were poor, and some repatriates died during the voyage home. Upon arrival in Japan, soldiers were processed again, officially demobilized, and then released to make their own way home if their homes still existed. For those whose hometowns had been destroyed by bombing or whose families had been killed, arrival in Japan marked the beginning of a new kind of difficulty as they tried to rebuild lives with nothing to return to. The repatriation process continued for years, with the last official repatriates arriving from Soviet camps in 1956, 11 years after the war's end. Even after that, occasional individuals would emerge from hiding in remote locations, requiring special arrangements to bring them home. The sheer scale and duration of the repatriation process illustrated the far-flung nature of Japan's empire and the massive displacement caused by its collapse. The varying national policies toward Japanese POWs created vastly different experiences depending on who captured them. Americans generally treated Japanese prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards once in captivity, though getting Japanese soldiers to surrender in the first place had been extraordinarily difficult. British and Commonwealth forces had similar policies, though the bitter memories of Japanese atrocities sometimes led to harsh treatment immediately after capture. Chinese forces, both nationalist and communist, had widely varying approaches. Some treated prisoners relatively well, while others executed them or subjected them to harsh labor. The Soviets, as discussed earlier, were particularly brutal. Filipino forces, having suffered enormously under Japanese occupation, sometimes executed prisoners on the spot or turned them over to angry civilians. These variations in treatment reflected the intensity of local suffering under Japanese occupation and the degree to which different Allied powers followed international law regarding prisoners. Within Japan itself, the transition from militaristic indoctrination to democratic values was jarring for returning soldiers. They had been taught absolute obedience to authority, belief in Japan's superior destiny, and contempt for individualism and democratic ideals. Suddenly, they were living in a society being reconstructed along democratic lines, with emphasis on individual rights, freedom of expression, and pacifism. The educational system that had taught militaristic values was completely overhauled. The government structure that had been dominated by the military was reorganized with civilian control. The very language of public discourse changed from the bombastic nationalism of wartime to more moderate and democratic rhetoric. For soldiers in their 20s and 30s, this transformation meant their formative years had been spent under one set of values that were now completely repudiated. Younger soldiers proved more adaptable to this change, while older veterans, especially officers who had built careers around the old system, often struggled more profoundly. Some veterans embraced the new democratic values, seeing them as Japan's path to a better future. Others maintained private reservations while publicly adapting. A minority actively resisted the changes, forming right-wing organizations that sought to preserve traditional values and revise the pacifist constitution. The educational backgrounds of soldiers had significant effects on their post-war trajectories. Those who had attended military academies and specialized schools found their credentials largely worthless after the war, as these institutions were closed and their degrees were not recognized in civilian fields. They had to start over, often at significant disadvantage compared to civilians with university degrees in fields like law, medicine, or engineering. Soldiers who had entered military service after completing civilian education had an easier time transitioning back, as they could return to their previous fields or related ones. The youngest conscripts who had been pulled from school to serve in the military's final, desperate months found themselves with interrupted educations and had to decide whether to return to school or enter the workforce immediately. The Japanese government eventually established programs to help veterans complete their educations or receive vocational training, though these programs were limited in scope and not all veterans could take advantage of them. The phenomenon of Japanese soldiers who became monks or priests after the war merits attention. Buddhism had long been intertwined with Japanese military culture, and some soldiers turned to Buddhist practice as a way of dealing with their wartime experiences. They entered monasteries, took vows, and dedicated themselves to spiritual practice and contemplation. For some, this was a form of atonement, seeking purification from the killing and violence they had participated in. For others, it was a way to make sense of the senseless loss they had witnessed. Buddhist concepts of impermanence, suffering, and karma provided frameworks for understanding the war's trauma. Some of these soldier monks later became prominent religious teachers, though they generally did not advertise their military pasts. Their turn to religion represented one form of the broader search for meaning that many veterans engaged in after the war. The treatment of disabled veterans presented significant challenges for post-war Japan. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been wounded during the war, suffering amputations, blindness, severe burns, and other permanent disabilities. Japan's economy was devastated and resources were scarce, making adequate care for these veterans difficult. The government established some support systems, including hospitals and rehabilitation centers, but these were often overcrowded and underfunded. Many disabled veterans struggled economically, unable to work and receiving minimal government support. Some became beggars on the streets of Japanese cities, their presence a constant reminder of the war's cost. The sight of disabled veterans struggling to survive was one factor that contributed to Japanese pacifism, as the visible cost of war was evident in every city. Over time, as Japan's economy recovered, support for disabled veterans improved, though many continued to face significant challenges throughout their lives. The Question of apologies from Japan for its wartime actions became increasingly important as decades passed. Individual veterans responded to this question in vastly different ways. Some offered sincere apologies for their actions and for Japan's aggression, participating in reconciliation efforts and speaking to young people about the horrors of war. These veterans believed that acknowledging the truth and expressing remorse was essential for preventing future wars and for honoring the victims. Others felt conflicted, believing that some apology was appropriate, but resenting what they saw as one-sided blame that ignored Allied war crimes or portrayed Japan as uniquely evil. A minority remained unrepentant, maintaining that Japan's war had been justified and that apologies were unnecessary. These divisions among veterans reflected broader Japanese society, which has struggled to develop a consensus on how to address the war's legacy. Official Japanese government apologies have been issued at various times, but their sincerity and adequacy have been questioned by victim nations, particularly given that some Japanese politicians have contradicted these apologies with revisionist statements. The contrast between European and Asian theatres in terms of post-war reconciliation is striking. Germany and its former enemies, particularly France, achieved significant reconciliation relatively quickly after World War II. The European Union eventually brought former enemies together in unprecedented cooperation. However, in Asia, reconciliation has been far more difficult. Japan's relationships with China and South Korea remain strained by history, with disputes over textbooks, territorial claims, and war memorials regularly reigniting tensions. Part of this difference stems from Japan's less complete reckoning with its wartime past compared to Germany's thorough denazification. Part stems from the complexity of Asian politics, where historical grievances have been exploited by various governments for domestic political purposes. Japanese veterans found themselves caught in these larger political dynamics, with their service and its meaning hotly debated both within Japan and internationally. As the last surviving veterans entered their final years in the early 21st century, there was increased urgency to record their testimonies. Organizations conducted extensive interview projects to preserve veterans' memories before they were lost forever. These oral histories revealed the full spectrum of wartime experiences, from those who had committed atrocities to those who had tried to maintain their humanity in inhumane circumstances. The testimonies provided invaluable historical data, but also raised difficult questions. How should society treat the confessions of elderly men admitting to war crimes committed in their youth? Should legal prosecution be pursued even decades after the fact, or should truth and reconciliation take priority? Different. Societies answered these questions differently, but the approaching end of the veteran generation added poignancy to these debates. The legacy of the Pacific War continued to influence Japan's military posture into the 21st century. The self-defense forces, while technically defensive, gradually expanded their capabilities and roles. Japanese forces participated in UN peacekeeping missions and eventually in supporting roles in conflicts like the Iraq War. Each expansion of the SDF's role sparked debate about whether Japan was abandoning its pacifist principles. Veterans and their descendants held diverse views on these developments. Some supported a more robust defense posture, believing that weakness invited aggression. Others championed strict pacifism, believing that any military build-up risked returning Japan to its militaristic past. The question of how Japan should defend itself while honoring its pacifist constitution and learning from its history remained contentious. The experience of Taiwanese Aboriginal troops who served Japan deserves specific mention. These indigenous peoples from Taiwan's mountains were recruited by Japan to serve in the military, particularly in jungle warfare units. After the war, they found themselves in a particularly complex situation. Taiwan had been returned to Chinese nationalist control, and these Aboriginal troops faced discrimination both for their service to Japan and for their indigenous ethnicity. Many tried to hide their military service and return to their communities. Some had developed affinity for Japanese culture during their service and faced suspicion from Chinese authorities for this reason. Their stories represent one of the many forgotten narratives of the war, a small group whose experiences don't fit neatly into the larger narratives, but who nonetheless deserve recognition. The role of the Japanese-American soldiers who fought for the United States during the war creates an interesting counterpoint to the Japanese soldier's story. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team and other Japanese-American units fought with distinction in Europe, while their families were interned in camps in the United States. After the war, these Japanese-American veterans had to reconcile their service to America with the treatment their community had received. When they encountered Japanese soldiers or visited Japan, the meetings could be awkward and complex, as they were ethnically Japanese but had fought against Japan. These encounters highlighted the tragedy of a war that divided peoples of shared ancestry and the complex nature of identity and loyalty. The long-term health effects of wartime service plagued many Japanese veterans. Beyond obvious wounds and disabilities, veterans suffered from tropical diseases contracted during service in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, chronic malnutrition effects from periods of starvation during the war's final phase, and various other ailments. The psychological impacts, including what we now recognize as PTSD, were not well understood or treated at the time. Many veterans struggled with nightmares, survivor's guilt, depression, and anxiety for the rest of their lives. The lack of adequate mental health support meant that many suffered in silence, self-medicating with alcohol, or simply trying to suppress their memories. The full extent of the psychological toll on Japanese veterans has likely never been fully documented or understood, as many never sought help or spoke about their experiences. Various Japanese veterans organizations played important roles in post-war society. Some were focused on mutual support and camaraderie, providing spaces where veterans could gather with others who shared their experiences. Others were more political, advocating for better treatment of veterans or for particular interpretations of history. A few became right-wing organizations that promoted nationalism and sought to revise the pacifist constitution. The most controversial organizations were those that denied or minimized Japanese atrocities, producing revisionist histories that claimed the Nanking massacre never happened, or that comfort women were voluntary prostitutes. These organizations drew criticism both internationally and from within Japan. However, they did represent a segment of veteran opinion and highlighted the lack of consensus about the war's meaning and Japan's responsibility. The economic contribution of veterans to Japan's recovery cannot be overstated. While politicians and business leaders often receive credit for the economic miracle, much of the actual work was done by veterans who brought military discipline, work ethic, and organizational skills to civilian endeavors. They worked in factories, built infrastructure, managed companies, and taught the next generation. Many started with nothing after the war, but through relentless effort built successful businesses or careers. Their contribution was often overlooked in favor of more dramatic narratives about visionary leaders or innovative technologies, but the steady, disciplined work of millions of veterans was fundamental to Japan's reconstruction. This economic contribution provided a form of positive legacy that helped offset the terrible legacy of the war itself. The fate of the Imperial Japanese Army's treasure remains a subject of speculation and occasional discoveries. As Japan's empire collapsed, military units and officials in various locations amassed hoards of looted wealth, precious metals, and valuable items. Some of this treasure was hidden, with the intention of recovering it later. Most was never recovered, either because those who hid it died without revealing locations, or because the treasure was in areas that became inaccessible after the war. Over the decades, occasional discoveries of buried or hidden wartime caches have been reported from the Philippines, Indonesia, and other former occupied territories. These discoveries have sometimes involved former soldiers returning to reveal hiding places. The treasure question adds an almost mythical dimension to the post-war story, suggesting that physical traces of the war remained hidden long after the fighting ended. As Japan developed into a major economic power and then faced new challenges in the late 20th and early 21st centuries with economic stagnation and demographic decline, the wartime generation's legacy became a subject of reflection. Some argue that Japan's generation of soldiers and civilians who experienced the war and rebuilding possessed special qualities of discipline, self-sacrifice, and determination that subsequent generations lack. Others counter that this romanticizes a difficult period and that each generation faces its own challenges. The debate over the wartime generation's legacy is part of broader Japanese discussions about national identity, values, and direction, how Japanese society should remember and learn from. The soldiers who fought in World War II remains an unsettled question, with different groups promoting different interpretations. The environmental and archaeological legacy of the war continues to surface. Unexploded ordnance from the war is still occasionally found in Japan and throughout Asia, sometimes killing or injuring people decades after it was fired or dropped. The wrecks of warships litter the Pacific floor, some serving as war graves for the sailors entombed within them. Battlefields from Okinawa to Burma still yield human remains, military equipment, and personal effects. These physical remnants ensure that the war cannot be completely relegated to history, but continues to have tangible presence. Veterans who survived have sometimes returned to battlefields as elderly men, seeking closure or honouring fallen comrades. These pilgrimages provided emotional resolution for some, and brought the war full circle as old men stood on ground they had fought over as young soldiers. The intergenerational transmission of trauma and memory within military families created lasting effects that extended well beyond the veterans themselves. Children of veterans often grew up in households marked by their fathers' wartime experiences, whether through stories told or through significant silences. Some veterans spoke freely about the war, ensuring that the next generation understood what had happened. Others never spoke of it at all, leaving children to puzzle over their father's occasional nightmares or distant moods. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of veterans have sometimes undertaken efforts to understand their ancestors' wartime experiences, researching unit histories, visiting battlefields, and interviewing surviving veterans. This generational engagement with the war's legacy ensures that even as the veterans themselves pass away, their experiences continue to shape Japanese society and memory. The experiences of officers from Japan's Naval Academy and Army Academy differed significantly from conscripted enlisted men. Academy graduates had chosen military careers and had been thoroughly indoctrinated in military values from young ages. Many came from military families with traditions of service spanning generations. For these professional officers, the defeat was not just a military loss, but a collapse of their entire worldview and career trajectory. Some adapted by finding new careers, but others never fully recovered from the psychological blow. The dissolution of their service academies and the prohibition on military careers meant that decades of training and tradition came to an abrupt end. Some former academy graduates secretly maintained contact networks and preserved traditions, hoping for an eventual restoration of a proper military, while others completely abandoned their military identities and reinvented themselves as civilians. The role of alcohol in veterans' post-war lives deserves examination. Japanese drinking culture had long been intertwined with military life, and many veterans continued heavy drinking after the war. For some, alcohol was a way to cope with trauma, suppress memories, and dull psychological pain. Alcoholism rates among veterans were high, though exact statistics are difficult to determine. The social acceptability of heavy drinking in Japanese culture meant that veterans' alcohol problems often went unaddressed. Families suffered as fathers and husbands drank away earnings or became violent when intoxicated. The impact of veterans' alcoholism on their families and on Japanese society more broadly has been under-examined in historical accounts, but represents a significant aspect of the war's long-term costs. The fate of Japanese soldiers who had served in the Philippines merits special attention due to the particularly brutal nature of fighting there and the strong Filipino animosity toward Japanese forces. The Philippines had suffered enormously under Japanese occupation, with estimates of Filipino deaths ranging from 500,000 to over 1 million. Japanese soldiers who surrendered or were captured in the Philippines faced significant danger from Filipino guerrillas and civilians seeking revenge. American forces often had to protect Japanese prisoners from Filipino vengeance. After the war, many trials of Japanese war criminals were held in Manila, and Filipino testimony about Japanese atrocities was extensive and damning. Japanese soldiers who had served in the Philippines and managed to return to Japan often carried particularly heavy burdens of guilt, having witnessed or participated in some of the war's worst atrocities. The enduring Filipino-Japanese tensions over wartime history have been only partially addressed despite official apologies and compensation payments, and veterans who served there often remain silent about their experiences due to the shame and controversy surrounding the Philippine campaign. The treatment of rank-and-file Korean and Taiwanese guards at POW camps presents one of the war's most troubling ironies. These colonial subjects had been forced into service by Japan and assigned to guard Allied POWs, often in the most brutal camps. They occupied a strange middle ground, being neither Japanese nor Allied prisoners, but occupying an uncomfortable space between victor and vanquished. After the war, dozens of these guards were prosecuted for war crimes, with some being executed or imprisoned. They argued that they had been forced into service and had followed orders from Japanese superiors, but courts often showed little sympathy. The prosecution of these low-ranking colonial subjects, while many higher-ranking Japanese officers escaped justice, struck many observers as unjust. Yet the brutality they had inflicted on prisoners was real and documented. Their cases highlighted the complicated questions of responsibility, coercion, and justice that pervaded the post-war trials. The phenomenon of Japanese soldier. Settlers in Manchuria represented one of the war's major population displacements. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, many connected to military personnel, had settled in Manchuria as part of Japan's colonization efforts. When the Soviet Union invaded in August 1945, these settlers faced catastrophic circumstances. Many were abandoned by retreating Japanese forces. They faced attacks from Chinese and Soviet forces, harsh winter conditions, starvation, and disease. Tens of thousands died. Chinese families in some cases adopted Japanese children whose parents had died or abandoned them. These children grew up as Chinese, often not learning their true origins until decades later. Some eventually made contact with Japanese relatives or returned to Japan, but many remained in China. The abandoned settlers and orphans represented one of the war's most tragic consequences and a source of enduring bitterness among those affected. The Kamicazi pilots who survived because the war ended before they could fly their missions often felt a complex mix of relief and guilt. They had been prepared to die, had said their farewells, and had been honoured as heroes about to make the ultimate sacrifice. Then suddenly the war was over, and they had to live. Some felt they had let down their comrades who had already died in kamikaze attacks. Others privately thanked fortune for their survival, while publicly maintaining the proper attitude of regret at not having fulfilled their mission. These survivors rarely spoke about their experiences, as discussing having prepared for a suicide mission was uncomfortable in peacetime society. Their psychological journey from acceptance of imminent death to the need to build a future was uniquely challenging. The experience of Japanese troops in the Burma campaign deserves attention. The campaign had been marked by devastating defeats, horrific jungle conditions, disease, starvation, and the complete collapse of supply lines. Survivors often referred to Burma as a hell on earth where disease killed more than combat. Those who returned from Burma were often in terrible physical condition, suffering from malaria, dysentery, malnutrition, and tropical diseases. The Burma campaign veterans felt that their suffering had been particularly intense and that the campaign had been poorly planned and supported by Tokyo. Many harboured resentment toward the officers and politicians who had sent them to fight in such conditions. The extreme hardships of Burma created a particularly tight bond among survivors, who felt that only those who had been there could truly understand what they had endured. The question of how Japanese veterans dealt with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki added another layer to their post-war experience. For many soldiers, the atomic bombs represented the ultimate demonstration of Japan's defeat and America's overwhelming power. The unprecedented destruction shocked even battle-hardened veterans. Some saw the atomic bombs as a war crime equivalent to or worse than anything Japan had committed. Others recognized that the bombs had possibly saved their lives by ending the war before the planned invasion of Japan, which would have resulted in massive casualties on both sides. The atomic bombings became a central part of Japan's post-war narrative as a victim of war, sometimes overshadowing discussion of Japan's own aggression. Veterans had complex relationships with this narrative, some embracing it as validation of their suffering, others uncomfortable with what they saw as selective memory that ignored Japanese crimes. The medical conditions in Japanese hospitals and aid stations during the war's final months had been appalling, and medical personnel who served in these conditions carried traumatic memories. With supplies exhausted, medications unavailable, and casualties overwhelming, military doctors and nurses had to make impossible decisions about who to treat and who to leave to die. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Infections raged unchecked. Wounded soldiers suffered and died in terrible conditions. Medical personnel who survived these experiences often suffered from moral injury and survivor's guilt, feeling they had failed their patients despite doing everything possible in impossible circumstances. Some left medicine entirely after the war, unable to continue in the profession after such trauma. Others dedicated themselves to improving civilian medical care, determined that such conditions should never be repeated. The fate of Japan's strategic materials and industrial capacity after defeat had direct impacts on returning soldiers seeking work. Much of Japan's industrial infrastructure had been destroyed by American bombing. The factories that survived were often seized by occupation authorities or converted to civilian production. The mining and resource extraction industries that had supported the war effort were largely shut down or severely curtailed. This meant that returning soldiers faced not just personal challenges, but an economy that was fundamentally disrupted. The jobs that many had expected to return to no longer existed. The industrial skills some had learned in military service were not applicable to the civilian economy. The occupation authorities' policies of breaking up zaibatsu conglomerates and restructuring the economy created further uncertainty. Only as the economy began recovering in the late 1940s and early 1950s did employment opportunities expand enough to absorb the returning veterans. The particular situation of Japanese soldiers who had fought in Soviet territory, primarily in the brief campaign in August 1945 when the Soviets invaded Manchuria, deserves mention. This campaign was devastating for Japanese forces. In just 2 weeks, the Soviets destroyed the Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Japanese military. Soldiers who survived the Soviet onslaught and were captured faced the brutal Siberian captivity discussed earlier. Those who died in the campaign often had their bodies left unrecovered, their fates unknown to their families for years or even decades. The speed and totality of the Soviet victory shocked Japanese veterans who had expected better from the Kwantung Army. It demonstrated just how outclassed Japan's forces were by modern, well-equipped armies by 1945. As Japan democratized under occupation guidance, some former soldiers entered politics, bringing military perspectives to civilian governance. A few achieved significant success, rising to positions in parliament or even higher office. Their military backgrounds were sometimes assets, demonstrating leadership experience and organizational ability, and sometimes liabilities, reminding voters of the militaristic past. The political careers of former soldiers reflected broader tensions in Japanese society about the military's role. Some former soldiers became advocates for pacifism, arguing from personal experience about war's horrors. Others promoted more nationalistic positions, arguing for stronger defense postures. The diversity of political positions held by former soldiers demonstrated that military service did not determine political outlook, as individual experiences and interpretations varied widely. The question of whether soldiers who had committed atrocities could truly rehabilitate themselves and become productive citizens troubled Japanese society. Some who had participated in terrible acts did successfully reintegrate, becoming law-abiding citizens who contributed to society. Did their post-war rehabilitation atone for their wartime crimes? Could someone who had committed murder or torture in war truly change? Or did the horrific nature of their crimes mark them permanently? Japanese society generally favored reintegration over permanent ostracism, taking a pragmatic approach that focused on present behavior rather than past actions. However, individual cases sometimes provoked controversy, particularly if the crimes were especially heinous or if the individual showed no remorse. The evolution of Japanese pacifism owes much to the experiences of returning soldiers. Having seen war's reality firsthand, many veterans became the most convincing advocates for peace. When they told young people that war was hell and should be avoided at all costs, they spoke with authority that politicians and academics lacked. Veterans' testimonies about the horrors of combat, the deaths of comrades, and the suffering inflicted and endured carried weight that abstract arguments could not match. The depth of Japanese pacifist sentiment in the post-war period was significantly influenced by millions of men who had personal experience with war's reality and wanted desperately to ensure that future generations never had to face what they had faced. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and gained a deeper understanding of what happened to Japanese soldiers after World War II ended. The fates of these millions of men were as diverse as the individuals themselves, ranging from execution for war crimes to quiet reintegration into civilian life, from decades hiding in the jungle to building new lives in foreign countries. Their stories reflect the broader tragedy of war and the complex challenges of achieving justice and reconciliation in its aftermath. If you enjoyed learning about this topic, make sure to check out our other videos about World War II history. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more historical content. See you in the next one.